Good morning, everyone. Today we will give a presentation about gender society and fashion. Amy will talk about the toxic masculinity. Sarah will introduce the male gaze. Hannah will discuss gender roles, nature versus nurture. And Rachel will talk about the gender fluid. I will introduce the three waves of feminism and how they changed fashion. The first wave occurring in the 19th and the early 20th century was mainly concerned with women's right to vote. During this time, women working towards suffrage were seen to be manly and masculine. They wore tailored suits with sashes that votes for women. Moving into the 1920s, women were able to vote and fashion began to change drastically. Coco Chanel was the first designer to introduce pantsuits to women's wear. Pants were finally acceptable for women during the 1930s, but could only be worn for loungewear or at the beach. As the Second World War began, men left their jobs for war and women were called to fill in the men's positions. They adopted men's work attire, but were still not seen wearing pants outside of work. In the 1950s, Dior's new look was taking all over. Subcultures such as beatnik and teddy style allowed women to incorporate pants into their everyday fashion. The second wave began in the 1960s with Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which encouraged women to find their identity in their lives through husbands and children. Fashion icons included Jackie Kennedy, and big-name designers included Pierre Cardin. Women began to protest and break down social norms for women in ways such as throwing their bras into freedom trash cans. The third wave of feminism began in the 1990s, refers to a continuation and reaction to the second wave. At that time, feminists didn't have to dress a certain way or be of a certain gender. Many subcultures arose that allowed even more self-expression. For instance, the Riot Girl movement encouraged females to become more involved in the male-dominated punk scene. Women's clothing has been refined depending on changes in political policies, periods of war, and feminist activism. Feminists have worked extremely hard to bring women to where we are today, feeling free to express ourselves through clothes however we want.
Toxic masculinity is a narrow and repressive description of manhood, defined by violence, sex, status, and aggression. It is the cultural ideal of manliness, whereby showing strength is of utmost importance and portraying any signs of emotion is deemed as a weakness. Sex and brutality are criteria for which men are measured, while in contrast, feminine traits ranging from emotional vulnerability and simply not being hypersexual can result in your manly status being taken away. Sentences such as, "Stop acting like a girl," "Real men don't cry," and "Man up" fuel toxic masculinity on impressionable boys. The commonly used saying, "boys will be boys," is often used as a get-out-of-jail-free card for boys, men, and toxic masculinities. Instead, it should be put forward. Boys will be what we teach them to be, as one day those boys will turn into men. Boys and men need spaces to explore their emotions and unpack problematic societal messages. Looking at the fashion industry and relating it to toxic masculinity, it is usual to see the men's clothing department being much smaller than that of the women's. It may seem like men have a choice and can wear whatever they like. However, after a quick browse, there is often lack of variety and colour compared to the women's offering. In recent years, women's fashion has seen a massive increase in plus-size availability. Models and mannequins who portray these body shapes are visible online and in stores. However, the fashion industry has only just started to address the issue of the plus-size male. Toxic masculinity is where the harmful effects of conforming to the traditional male ideal are brought to the forefront. Not including plus-size clothing, having less variety and less colour offering, all contribute to men feeling insecure in themselves. Men are also affected by body confidence and gender stereotypes. The difficulty of being a man is often put to the side. There are many societal changes that need to happen to ensure men don't feel pressured to fit into a certain man box. There are a number of important people in the spotlight, such as Harry Styles, Jonathan Van Ness and Frank Ocean, who are breaking the mould and destroying toxic masculinity, which Rachel will pick up on later in the presentation. I will now pass you on to Sarah, who will give you an insight into the internalised male gaze.
Following on from toxic masculinity, we see the emergence of the male gaze. The male gaze was coined by film theorist Laura Mulvey in 1975 when she wrote about the objectification of women throughout mainstream cinema. The male gaze can be defined as viewing or depicting women in a fetishized manner from a masculine perspective. Mulvey's theory stems from Freud's psychoanalytic theories in identifying activity with masculinity and passivity with femininity. The male gaze is often referred to in cinema, where the purpose of the female characters is to exist solely to satisfy the heterosexual male viewer. This is achieved through camera angles, lighting, wardrobe and makeup. One example where we see the male gaze being catered to is in the 2007 rendition of Transformers, where Megan Fox's character is used to attract the male audience, with cameras panning over her body in a sexual manner in many of her scenes. In fact, this objectification of women is seen in most of Hollywood cinema if you pay close attention. The reason behind this might make more sense when we realise that 95% of all mainstream American cinema produced has been created by white men. Unfortunately, once you begin to realise the male gaze in practice in the majority of visual media and in our reality, it is very difficult to unsee it. Furthermore, the male gaze is so normalised that women have subconsciously internalised it, whereby they view themselves in light of how a man would see them. Undoubtedly, the fashion industry has played a massive part in selling this narrative of women in the past through sexist advertising. However, feminists have challenged this through the recent theory of the female gaze. Dior's creative director Maria Grazia Chiuri made it clear when she arrived at Dior that she intended to work with female photographers to view femininity from a different point of view to what we are used to. Grazia wanted to challenge the male gaze and remove the sexual tension that came with having a man behind the camera. Dior Talks podcast launched a series titled The Female Gaze in 2020, which provides a platform for women in the industry to share their experiences with feminism. Now Hannah will talk to you about the nature versus nurture debate.
The idea of nature versus nurture in terms of gender identity is controversial and highly debated topic. Nature versus nurture in this context is the comparison between the learnings children obtain from their biological makeup and the things they learn over time through socialisation at home and in other social institutions. The debate is whether kids turn out the way they do because they were just born that way, or if things they learn over time from their families and peers or other social sources. Anthony Sculio discusses how parents communicate gender to children through a pathway is constructed for children through toys, colour and how they are addressed, suggesting that we as adults construct children's pathways by instructing them on what they should do, not what they can do. Similarly, Bow and Woods explain through their examinations parental behaviours not only reveal biases regarding gender, whether conscious or unconscious, but also have the potential to influence early development of gendered behaviour and preferences. We saw examples of this in last week's lecture from the BBC Nature versus Nurture series. In this series, all participants, whether conscious or unconscious of it, engaged in giving children the toys that suited for their genders they expressed through their clothing. Dr. Hines from Cambridge University also presented on this series, showcasing the results what happened when monkeys were given the same gender-specific toys. All monkeys unconsciously picked the toy that was best related to their gender. As a result, there was no specificity between nature versus nurture, with the series concluding furthermore that males were instantly drawn to motion moving parts due to the way their brain works. Scientist Joel goes on further to explain our brains male or female. Apparently, new studies have shown 15 minutes of stress can change sexes in the brain from male form to female form and the female form to the male form. She goes on to explain further that scientists now believe male and female brains have many of the same psychological capabilities, with the only differences noted that the male brain was more aggressive while the female brain was more compassionate. A study in 2017 in America revealed the biggest gap can be seen in encouraging children to talk about their feelings when they are upset, saying 59% of adults say that there is little emphasis on encouraging boys to talk about their feelings, while only 38% said the same about girls. While some studies have discussed this idea of gender beginning to be recognised from the minute of conception, Stenz 2005 and Kohlberg 1996 declared that infants are agender, do not recognise or demonstrate their gender until around 24 months, while they do not verbally self-identify until the age of 2.5. Now Rachel will talk about gender in the future.
Gender stereotypes are defined as the generalisation of attributes, characteristics and roles onto each gender. This can be described as believing that all women love makeup, wearing dresses, and the colour pink, while the idea of men should be strong, powerful, independent, and to do things too difficult for women to handle. Although these types are still prevalent in today's society, change is slowly but surely occurring, and the number of those challenging these norms is on the rise. Celebs like Emma Watson, who's a UN Women's Goodwill Ambassador, have launched campaigns such as He for She, a movement urging for men to advocate for gender equality, as it's a human rights issue as opposed to merely a women's issue. Harry Styles is someone who's definitely been stereotyped along his journey in fame, as a young man in the public eye. We just need to look at mainstream media to see he has been perceived as the typical masculine type with regards to his many relationships with women. On the contrary, in recent years, Harry has shown there's a lot more depth to masculinity than what has been socially constructed, constantly helping to redefine this term by supporting movements like He for She and the resurgence of gender-fluid fashion. He has donned skirts and dresses on the cover of Vogue and is often spotted out wearing YSL women's with little to no care. A quick mention of some other celebs who have pioneered gender-fluid fashion and questioned stereotypes for years would be Boy George, David Bowie, Kurt Cobain, and Eddie Izzard. Gender-fluid fashion has been a social construct-breaking movement since its corrective attempts on rigid stereotyping in the 50s. This really began in autumn-winter 1966 with the iconic YSL smoking suit, designed for women by a man. In the 60s and 70s, icons in the music industry helped to further blur these lines with the introduction of androgynous fashion, which was adopted by peers and fans worldwide. In the 90s, grunge enabled a resurgence of the unisex era, where lumberjack shirts and combat boots were in style for both sexes. And this movement has become mainstream yet again in years as recent as 2015, with the Gucci catwalk presenting pussy bows and feminine silhouettes for men, and Billy Porter's 2019 Oscar tuxedo gown look. The future resurgence of this movement is apparent, and upon us. Let's raise boys and girls the same way, break gender roles, continue to debunk toxic masculinity, and pave a new path for the future.